Good evening. Somebody's left their keys. Looks like it's a Toyota. Kind of takes a key, not a fob, so somebody left their keys. It's probably somebody in one of the young people. Not that you're not young people, but yeah. Okay, so we're continuing our study in the book of John. We'll start chapter 2 today. Any comments or questions or anything about chapter 1 that Herschel can answer, or one of our preachers or teachers or elders? It's interesting when to me, it's interesting thinking of John as he writes this book, knowing that he probably had available to him Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how much time had passed, and how he knew he wasn't writing to a specific audience, but things that he wanted to convey. And as we look at tonight's lesson, some of the things that we'll see, because like, for example, when we get to chapter 2, in the book of John, Jesus' mother, Mary, is never named Mary. So whenever John refers to Mary, it's always Jesus' mother. And why he wouldn't name her, wouldn't say Mary, but it's just interesting, to me anyway, and I don't have an answer for it, so maybe that's one of those philosophy people can answer that, but it's interesting that when John writing, and I don't know if it's just because he assumes everyone knows who Jesus' mother is, but she's not named. It seems loud to me. Is that just John?
I think it could have been the fact that Jesus kind of handed his mother over to John, and he may have called her mother. Who knows?
Yeah.
And the fact that calling her Mary probably was kind of maybe awkward for him.
That might be, because when we look at today, when he refers to her as woman, he also does that the same thing in chapter 19 at the cross. So, it might be that John thought of her, took her in as his mother, and took care of her as if she was his mother, and might have thought that, and maybe that's it. I don't know. I buy that as much as anything, unless somebody else has another one that's better. But I think that's probably good. Okay, then let's start with chapter 2. If somebody would read the first 11 verses.
On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. When the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. And he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him.
Okay, so let's look at that text then. And so here we have, according to John, this is Jesus' first miracle that he performed when he starts his ministry. And what John also doesn't deal with is Jesus' baptism and then the temptation. So we just have basically John in verse 1 of chapter 1 talks about in the beginning was the Word. So we basically have John starting Jesus' ministry. We have in chapter 1 where he does have disciples, apostles, come to him, and there are 4 that come to him at the end of the chapter. And then we start with, now, and obviously all of us who are Christians know that chapter 2 is what man put in there. There's really not a break when John's writing it. He's not writing in chapters, but it's probably a different thought. But so we're not sure what that third day is, whether that's the third day of the wedding feast, whether that's the third day after Nathanael became an apostle. But it tells us it's on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. And then here, very beginning, he says the mother of Jesus was there. Mary was, this possibly would have been a relative maybe that Mary was involved with, because obviously she seemed to be involved with the wedding as far as what was going on. Jesus was actually invited and his disciples, which at that time there was probably 4. Who were they? Who were the disciples at that point? Bill, were you just waving, or were you going to answer? Who were the 4 apostles then, according to chapter 1?
Peter, Andrew, Nathaniel, and
Philip. Yeah, so those are the only 4 that we know of at that point, and we assume then that's who was with him. So Mary, now this is the question then, did Jesus do miracles as a child? Did Jesus do miracles as a child? No. There's nothing telling us that, and we'll look at later in this chapter when it talks about his brothers. We can look at chapter 5. His brothers didn't even really believe on him, where people try to say that he did all these things as a young child. He didn't. But Mary, what did Mary know for sure about Jesus? Yeah, he was the Son of God. I mean, she knows better than anyone that she was a virgin and she became pregnant. And an angel told her that it was the Son of God. So she knew that her son was going to be something special. She probably didn't really know what that was, but then here at the wedding feast, she sees probably for the first time Jesus and then his apostles. So she now, and again, these are assumptions, she now thinks, okay, he's got apostles, he's now a man. Now, some people, we never hear about Joseph. Some people think that possibly Joseph has died, maybe died much earlier. And Jesus being the oldest, that he kind of helped take care of the family till they became of age. And we'll see that Jesus did have brothers and sisters. So there's a lot of assumptions we don't know, because all we know is what we know, and that is that we know when he was 12 what happened, and then basically we don't know anything other than that he grew in wisdom and stature and favor of God and man. So we're not sure of the relationship there, but we do know that Mary knew he was special. And so Mary comes to him then and basically says they have no wine. Now, some people get caught up in the way he comes across to her as woman. When he addresses her, let's talk about that. Now, I'm 60 years old, and when I talk to my mom, I still say mom. I still call my mom mom, and I'm sure most of us probably do the same. I don't know how Jesus had talked to Mary before in their relationship, but now that he's becoming in his ministry, he addresses her as woman. And maybe this is where he's making that distinction with her now, that, okay, now I'm still your son, but now I'm God's son and I have a mission, and my ministry starts. So there's no disrespect. A lot of people think that that's disrespect, the way he addressed her as woman, but that's not the case. And as I said, if we go to the cross, when he's on the cross before he dies, he says, woman, he addresses her again as woman, thy son, and then to the apostle he loves, which is John, that your mother. Anyone else have any thoughts about that?
I read a commentary once that they thought that was actually a term of
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we try to apply it to how we use it today, and that's not how it was used there. But there was no disrespect on Jesus' part with Mary. What did he mean by my hour has not yet come? Beginning of his ministry? Okay, is that what everybody agrees? His hour has not come, that it's his ministry, beginning his ministry? His crucifixion hour? Yeah, that was a way off, but yes, I don't know if that's what he was referring to there. I think it was more that it was time for his ministry to start, and that's what he was preparing for. Yes. Now, some of the commentators that I read basically said that possibly, where I mentioned before that maybe Joseph had died earlier, and that Jesus had been the man around the house, and that she could have came to him as we're out of wine. I mean, if Tony was here Saturday for Ladies' Day, and if Joy ran out of something, she would have gone to Tony and says, we're out of bread. Now, she wouldn't have said that expecting Tony to miraculously create bread, but she went to him because there was a problem. And it could be that when Mary came to Jesus here, because there was an issue, and that's because they were out of wine. And we don't know that. I mean, that's what one commentator said, that it could be that that's how she didn't come to him as so much as expecting a miracle, but trying to get him to help with a solution. But what he does then, yeah. In the customs in those days, and we don't know, like I said, when it talks about the third day, we don't know, because sometimes weddings in those days were 7 days. So imagine 7 days of a wedding feast that everybody was, basically it involved everybody. But anyway, it happens. Mary comes to Jesus with a problem, and then Jesus does. And Mary has the faith in her son, because she tells the servants, basically, that whatever he says to do, do. Now, what does Jesus do then? What does he instruct them to do? Go out to the wine press, throw in some grapes, start dancing around? No, he tells them there's 6, and there's probably some significance with that number, but he says there's 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews. So let's think about, what are those water pots for? What were they used for? Purification. Yeah. What's the sink used for in the bathroom? I guess I shouldn't ask that, but yeah. But these were for purification, and they really weren't for drinking water. But that's what's there, and he tells them to do what? Fill them all the way up to the brim. And does Jesus do anything? Hocus pocus, or does he? I mean, there's nothing that would show, if there was somebody watching, that Jesus did anything miraculous here by having them just fill up the pots of water to the brim. And then he instructs them to draw some out and then take it to the master of the feast. And what do they find? What's the master of the feast say? Yeah, it was good wine. Now, was this an intoxicating wine? No, it's not. So anyone that gets that confused, when we look about what Jesus was making there in those 6 water jugs, he wouldn't have made that much wine to get everybody all drunk. So that's not wine, an intoxicating wine that Jesus made that means it's okay for us to drink. People try to use that, but that's not what this is about. This isn't intoxicating wine that was produced here.
Well, they also try to push the idea, well, people let the fish be so intoxicated that they'll go to the bad, so save your bad for last.
Yeah.
But they also push that.
Yeah, they try to push that where they say they're drunk. Now, That's not the case. It's not an intoxicating drink where they were drunk and didn't know the difference. That's not the case. One of the things that I read that was interesting with this is in those days, religious leaders, how did they deal with the common folk? How did the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders, how did they like dealing with the common folk? Pretty shabbily, but they didn't like to be rubbing elbows to elbows with them, did they? But what did Jesus do? He was at a wedding feast. I mean, he was there. He was social. He and the apostles were invited, and they came, and they were there. And so, for those where we look at at that time, Jesus didn't go by the custom of man, religious man, did he? And we can look at things that Jesus did that was against when he had meals, when he ate with the sinners. Did Jesus do that? Yeah. Who did he eat with? Matthew? Yeah, he was a publican, and then all the publican friends were there. So they were all. And what did the scribes and Pharisees say? And this is in Mark chapter 9, I think it is, verse 3. But Mark 2, 13 through 17, where Jesus was with common folk, because that's who he came to reach, is the common man. And so here at a wedding feast, he performs his first miracle. And then we know nothing about who the bride and groom were. We don't know if they were any relatives. Like I said, if there were, we know nothing about them. All we know is that there were really, the servants were there and the master, but Jesus was there, the 4 apostles, and Mary, and then that's all that we really know that matters for this, what John wrote. Verse 11 says that this beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, do you think the disciples already believed in Jesus? These 4, what did they hear John the Baptist say about him? And maybe those who were John's disciples, might have witnessed Jesus' baptism and the Holy Spirit come on him like a dove. So they might have heard and saw that and hear God say what God said. So I'd say that probably there was already some belief, but this then solidified it for those 4 as well as those that were there.
There was always, you read about miracles that the disciples always afterwards, they were just amazed. They'd say, like when he stilled the storm, what manner of man is this that even the winds obey him? You know, he kept doing those things. And then, of course, when Nicodemus came to him, he said that no man can do what you do except
through the
except God be with you.
Yeah.
So this was to help them and to bring them along as much as it was for the outside people.
Yeah. 'Cause like I said, other than the apostles and Mary and the servants that were there, they didn't really know that Jesus did anything. I mean, unless there were everybody watching, which I doubt, that they didn't even know that this was happening till it happened. But the apostles knew, and Mary knew. And then in verse 12 it says, and then after this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. Now that's one verse, but that says a lot. Who does a whole religious group worship as being Virgin Mary? I mean, there's a whole religious group that worship Mary and the fact that Mary is a virgin. Now, Mary was a virgin at this time when Jesus was born, but Mary wasn't a virgin after that. And in this verse, chapter 12, it says that he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. So let's talk about that. In Mark chapter 6, somebody could turn to that, Mark 6, verse 3. Okay, that's also in Matthew chapter 13, verses 55 through 56, and it says that it asks the question. I mean, they knew Jesus as a carpenter's son, and it lists his brothers. And we know more about James in the future. We'll know more about James, but there it lists that he had brothers and sisters. So Mary was no longer a virgin. Mary was just Jesus' mother. And while she served the purpose, but once that purpose was served, she was no different from any other, as far as woman in history, in the church. We don't worship Mary at all. I mean, we talk about Mary, we tell the story because of the miraculous birth and all the things that happened with it, but as far as worshiping or putting her on a pedestal, we don't do that. And she was a mother.
One of the keys to that, too, is in Matthew chapter 1, we talked about Joseph took her for his wife, and then he knew her not
Right.
until after the birth of Jesus.
Right.
So
Right. That's what he was in.
she wasn't
Yes.
a virgin until after
Right.
his birth.
Right.
Then,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. So if we look at that, Matthew, where that occurs, and then we look here where we see named our brothers and sisters. And it doesn't name the sisters, it just says sisters. So we know by sisters there was at least 2. So that means that Mary had at least 6 other children other than Jesus.
Well, and it could have been too. I know I've got a Catholic Bible at home. When you read this in the Catholic Bible, they got footnotes down at the bottom, and they'll say these relatives were probably cousins.
Yeah.
So I mean, they change all that
Yeah.
in order to keep their doctrine.
Yeah.
They have to do that because
Well, no, and one of the,
if you read it, it's plain.
yeah,
But if you know,
if you try to make a man's twist to it, because I read some commentaries that tried to do that too and say these might have been Joseph's children from a previous marriage, but when Jesus was born, when they were gone, it was only Joseph and Mary, and then, well, she was with child. So it wasn't like he was taken when they were going to Bethlehem when Jesus was born. It wasn't like they were taking a caravan of Joseph's children with them at that time. So man can try to make a story out of anything they want to. That's why it's important we take the Scripture and we study it and we know, and we tie these verses together so that you can prove that Mary was a mother to other children.
well, another verse describes how Jesus had brothers. In Galatians, Paul said that he went to Jerusalem afterwards, and he seen nobody except James, the Lord's brother.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Bible
Yeah.
over repeatedly states that out.
Yeah. In John 5, we'll read that his brothers didn't believe on him, but then they do. After his ministry is fulfilled and those things happen, they do. But in chapter 5 of John, he mentions that these brothers, at that point, they still don't believe that Jesus is anything different than anyone else. And just a note on Mary and why she knew so about Jesus, if we go back to Luke, relatives is what.
Relatives, they don't make it out to be his brother.
Well, what I think of that is, if it may be relatives, then she may be a virgin. But it doesn't say that, does it? No. Because that's really what it's saying. She may be a virgin. If it says they may be relatives, because it's one or the other. It's like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't.
Okay. But just real quick on Mary knowing about Jesus, also then when we know that in Luke chapter 2, verses 28 through 38, that's where Simeon basically talks about Jesus. Behold, this child is destined for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign which will be spoken against. Yes, a sword will pierce through your own soul also, and the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. So, and then Anna also bears witness. So Joseph and Mary witnessed that, and then also then in following on in verse 41 through 51, when they go and he's not with them when they leave, and they go back, and he's actually in the temple with basically the elders of and having discussions. So those are things that Mary witnessed when we talk about Mary and her knowledge of Jesus and what she knew. This is what she knew that. And then seeing Jesus, like I said, with the apostles, probably then in her mind she knew that this was a start. At some point she knew it was going to happen, and now it was happening. Okay, so we know that Jesus had brothers and sisters. No one has a problem with that, right? Okay. All right, let's look at verses 13 through 17. Jimmy, you want to read that?
Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of a small cord, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep, the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, take these things in, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. And the disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house has eaten me up.
Okay, so here we have, it is the Passover, and Jesus, following custom, was observing the Passover. But what was happening in the temple? Money changers, things being sold. Is there a problem with that? Yeah, they were making money. One of the things that one of the commentators that I read says only healthy animals were to be sacrificed at the temple, lest people offer sick and lame animals as offerings. So at first people brought their own animals, and the priests inspected them to make sure that they were healthy before sacrificing them. Fast forward a few hundred years, and the priests were telling the people to leave their animals at home, instead just come and buy animals at the temple. But there was a catch. Since the priests couldn't touch coins that bore Caesar's image, the people first had to change their money for a fee, of course, into a special temple money, so that the Jewish leaders and their merchants at the temple were making money twice. So that was kind of a little bit of the history to it, is what was happening. And Jesus knew what was happening, that they were money changers, that they were basically making money. That would be like we charge you to come in here. One of the things I see on Facebook, and it's people going to a football game where there's like 12 inches of snow, and people pay to get in there, and it's crowded, the stadium's full. But here, we got heat, we got air conditioning, we don't charge anything, but what do we have? Empty pews. So it's kind of people still went to the temple when they did what they had to do, but then to simplify it, make it easy, there were people who took advantage of them there.
I liken this to the televangelists today. I mean, these people were using the time of sacrifice to make money. I mean, that's
Exactly.
That's what.
It was a requirement. I mean, that's yeah.
So, but they were using that, like the televangelists use religion today as a way of making money. That's what these people were doing.
Yeah.
I read these men are getting enormously rich at things they were doing
It was a good business.
on their own pockets.
Yeah. So what Herschel said is that one of the things that he read was that these men that were doing this were actually became very rich in taking advantage of what they did by charging this fee and doing these things. And like Tony said, they took advantage of a requirement, a religious requirement that, and today we can tie that to television evangelists who know that people know they should be doing church, so they try to make it simple for them, add a little fee. Just mail in your gift, and you'll be blessed. So we can tie that to that also. Yeah. Whoops. It's me this time, not anyone else making noise. Yes, it's what the religious leaders could do. But what this shows us about Jesus was that he wasn't just a meek man. People try to make him out as being feminine or something. I mean, they try to, but here, what Jesus did there was something that was a bold move. And it showed, we talked the first week about, or second week, about how John showed different emotions that Jesus had. And here we see that he was angry. And it wasn't just because of what they were doing, but where were they doing this? In the house of the Lord, his Father's house. And that's how he referred to it, that in his Father's house. Destroy take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. So here we have John. Again, one of the things we talked about in the first week, that one of the things of the book of John as the writer, one of his main points to make is that Jesus is the Son of God. That's what his real emphasis is. And we see that even here where he talks about this, and he talks about how Jesus says, my Father's house. So he claims then that if it's his Father's house, that he's the Son of God. Don?
Matthew 21, 12, 13 says, Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and said of them, as written, my house shall be called the house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves.
Okay, and that was Matthew 21, 12 and 13. It's also in Mark, and it's also in Luke. And I think the other books, like here, when John does it, it's in his early ministry, but I think the other books is the last week of his life. 2 different cleansings, yes. So, okay, so Jesus cleanses the temple. Any other comments or anything about that? And let's look at verses 18 through 22. Paul, you have that?
18 through 22?
Yes.
So the Jews answered and said to him, what sign do you show us since you do these things? Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then the Jews said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said these things to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said.
Okay. So what's Jesus talking about here then in these verses? What's he foretelling?
He's foretelling his death and his resurrection.
Exactly. He's foretelling his death and resurrection. But what are the leaders hearing him say? Literally.
That he can build the building in 3 days.
Yeah. What did they say? It took how long? 46 years? It took 46 years to build this temple, and you'll raise it up in 3 days. So they were thinking literally the temple, and that's not what he said. But again, when we look at the apostles, John writes here that we go 3 years in advance. When Jesus is crucified and risen, they remember this conversation, and that Jesus said that he would do this very thing, and they believed in him even more. It tells us there in verse 22. Okay, let's finish the chapter. Peter, 23 through 25.
Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name, and they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people, and needed no one to bear witness about them, for he himself knew what was in them.
Okay. So what do you think Jesus was doing then in verse 23 when it talks about that? What do you think Jesus was doing at that time? Wait for answer. Was he healing? I mean, because it says that he wasn't really looking for that. To me, it could be that he wasn't doing. Obviously, he did miracles so people knew who he was, but could it be here, though, that he did many things in Jerusalem that believed that he did it for the common people, again, where he healed and he did things for those folks so that they would believe. But he didn't commit himself to them because he knew all men. What's it mean that he knew all men?
They might believe it for a while once they see the miracles, but the belief they might stop believing once the miracles stop.
Okay, Paula says that it could be that he knew that they would basically be interested right now because they see the miracle, but then they'll die off. Their interest or their belief will die off.
He also probably knew the hearts of the Pharisees and Sadducees, and it says there didn't trust himself in them, which seems to say that he wasn't going to be in a position where the Sadducees and Pharisees could do anything to him.
Because they had asked him for a sign too, because they said back in verse 18, what signs do you show to us since you do these things? So they were asking him to do miracles then, show us something that, and he didn't do that. He didn't cave into them, and when he could have, he could have turned them into stone or something, but he didn't do that where they asked him in verse 18, which is kind of your point there.
They could deny his miracles, but they said, well, he did this with the power of the devil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, he knew the hearts of men in the sense that he knew that they might be excited about this momentarily and then just forget about it and go their own way. I think many times that's why we have the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. He wanted that done every week.
Every week, yeah. Yeah, because that's kind of what Paul has said, too, that it was the fact that he knew that they could be impressed with that initial miracle, but then it would just forget about it, and, which is probably the case, Jimmy.
We read in Mark chapter 1 from Jesus of the evening, the people would come to him and he healed all manners of sickness. And then the next day, he was up early and gone up in the mountain. And the disciples came to him and said, Lord, what are you doing all these people?
Yeah.
I mean, you can be the greatest thing ever was. He said, we need to go into the next towns because I need to go preach the gospel. That's what I came for. So he didn't want to get bogged down
Right.
with these. He could have been the greatest.
Yeah. Right.
Imagine the people would flock to him if they hear somebody
Well,
heal all manner of sickness.
no doubt they did, and that's
Yeah.
like when we look at the last two verses of this book, that if he listed all these things, that's why I say here, where he did things in Jerusalem that were unlisted, but probably, he didn't say no to anybody. I don't believe as far as from a healing, but he knew when he had to then
He had to
move away. Yes.
He had to
Yeah.
move on and do his mission.
Yeah.
That's what the book of Mark teaches us, that
Yeah.
I got to go in the next town because I came to preach.
Right. His mission wasn't just to do signs. It was, yeah. John? Right. He had to be, and his father's business was preparing to establish the church.
Well, later on in John chapter 6, Jesus is performing miracles, and they're going to force him to be king. They're going to take him by force, make him king, and he went away to a mountain.
Yeah.
Because obviously that wasn't
Right.
purpose.
Yeah. Now, it's amazing when you study Jesus and how really he was, just an awesome person. Who wouldn't have an ego, or who wouldn't? But that wasn't his purpose. His purpose was just simply to go about his father's business. And he basically probably never turned anybody away, but then he knew when he had to, then let's move on to the next town. So I know when John's beheaded and when he dies, when Jesus tries to just get away, the crowds just come and he stops and heals. Any other things on chapter 2?
He could have healed everybody.
Sure.
One,
Yeah.
by one word, he could have beat back the Roman army. He could have done all those things. That wouldn't have
then when we jump ahead to his crucifixion, and I've said it before, who knows how many of these people that he's healed or they've witnessed these things were in that crowd yelling, crucify him, because they got caught in that mob mentality. And no doubt, in my mind, some of these very people that we talk about that have witnessed it firsthand or could have even been part of that, and they forget, how quickly they forget. Okay, thank you.